We are going to get started. Welcome you all to this wonderful Good Friday, in which we are going to be studying, revisiting the Cuban Republic with an emphasis on artists and intellectuals. We have four distinguished guests. One probably will not show up, María Valero, and therefore we have more time for ourselves. We will start with María. And then we'll follow with Vicki, and then with, you go last, right? That's his preference. Cuba, as we discussed here, again, we'll welcome you all. Alejandro, you've been here many times. We thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful contribution to whatever it is we do together in New York City. He comes all the way from New Jersey, where it's a holiday today, right?
Yes.
Good. So, Cuba was in the Republic 1902-1958. It was really a transitional society in many ways. It was a transition from colonial outpost of Spain, no democracy for centuries, very little participation, a lot of hard rule, strongman rule, and then you had a transition to something else. Very fast, Cuban society emerged through the intellectuals, the old generales that fought in the War of Independence, the various factions that fought for autonomismo. They were not necessarily independentista for pro-independence. They were some of them were actually in favor of closer relations with the U.S. Number one, and number two, retaining relations with Spain. So you had three main groups, and the generals, who were mostly, of course, in the Independencia camp, were fighting at the beginning of the Republic for 1902, 1923, in the context of relations with the U.S., which were very difficult throughout this whole entire period. You have these generals who wanted to kind of control the politics. They failed, by and large, and then you had around 1923, when before Machado got elected, when Sayas was the president, you had a lot of new groups emerging, estudiantes, students, intellectuals, artists, making a claim to participation, to being relevant in creating imageries and visions of the new nation, as well as in participating in society and politics. Eventually, many of them did. So you have a lot of different groups, which then the whole thing, the generals on the one hand, the new groups, the armed forces under eventually Batista, who was a revolutionary at the beginning, the whole thing exploded after 1933 with the revolution against Machado, which overthrows Machado. And then you have a period essentially, and I'm just going over this very fast, of revolutionary instability between 33 and 36 or 37. Many groups, a lot of violence. Actually, I was amazed. What we were doing a study of the various groups that were fighting, and it's just amazing. In 1935, for instance, the killing of Antonio Guiteras in Matanzas. There was a lot of people mobilized for that in late 1938, 36. In Havana, many various uprisings, and a lot of actually dying and fighting more than they had imagined. We'll go back to revisit those often surprising events and groups that mobilized with a very rich set of agendas about how to change Cuba, using very loosely the word revolutionary. They were all revolutionarios, new visions, creating a new society. Whatever happened in the 50s clearly grew from those ideas of the 30s. Samuel Farber has written about this period, and we'll go back with him and others to explore the 30s, and then what I call the search for post-revolutionary stability between 36 and 52, where finally Cubans come up with a party system, political partidos políticos, and it functions, I would argue, reasonably well, but then it collapses and there's a lot of conflict with various groups. So there's a lot of divergence, opinions and visions about Cuban society, and intellectuals and artists are in the middle of the thing. We're going to go back to The Cubans really it's a surprisingly modern society throughout this period. Even in the late 19th century, you had various publications, very good publications, newspapers. Here's a list. You had Bohemia in 1908, amazing story, Bohemia, which played a key role from Republic, El Gráfico, in the graphic arts, a pioneer, 1913. Cuba Contemporánea, which were people who came from the latter part of the 19th century, who had various visions of a Cuban society and identity, and then Social, which we're going to be studying next, with Nadia and Vicki. And we're going to touch base on Massaguero, the wonderful artist that we're going to all rediscover in new light. And that's one of the things we look forward to. And then you have Carteles and Revista de Avance, a very important publication, Avance in 1927, 1930, Orígenes, and then Nuestro Tiempo, which is, you're going to be addressing Nuestro Tiempo, right? So we're going to be focusing today on the intellectuals and artists who published on their works of art and their reflections, right? In this instrument, these publications, and others. So I look forward to this wonderful discussion. And María, you want to go first? So again, thank you.
Buenas tardes y gracias por asistir a esta sesión. Mauricio me pidió, I'm sorry, I have to speak in English, okay? Yes, Mauricio asked me to speak about Social because about 5 years ago I edited an edition of a novel that had been published in Social in the edition of 1926, which actually Vicki has the entire collection for that year, and she will be presenting some images from the 1926, the 12 issues in which the novel appeared, and the novel was written by some of the best-known intellectuals of the time, Jorge Mañac, Alfonso Hernández Catá, Rubén Martínez Villena, Max Enrique Sureña, Emilio Roig, the Loixenring, and some of the illustrators were amongst the most important who brought modernism to Cuba, such as José Manuel Acosta, José Hurtado de Mendoza, Rafael Blanco, and the caricaturist Armando Maribona, who was very well known in Paris, and that's where before he went to Cuba and collaborated on the magazine, and also Carlos Sanchez. My presentation is meant as an introduction, again, to Vicki's collection. Social was founded in 1916 by Conrado Massaguer, an illustrator and caricaturist who, together with his brother Oscar, had pioneered in the graphic arts and publishing. That same year, Massaguer founded the Instituto de Artes Gráficas, Institute for Graphic Arts, and an agency, Anuncios que se ven, a publicity agency where he also used his designs and some of his caricatures. Massaguer had harbored ambiguous aims for the magazine from the start. On the one hand, Social catered to the desire for prominence of the new Cuban bourgeoisie that had become enriched as a result of the rise in the price of sugar after World War I. On the other hand, following the urgings of Emilio Roig de Loixenring, director of the literary section of the magazine, until its demise in 1938, it advanced criteria and ideologies that undermined the very hegemony of that class. Social was a unique blend of bourgeois banality, artistic vanguard, and encompassed social chronicle, fashion, film reviews, various kinds of advertisements, going from cars to French couture, and some of the best poems and stories of its generation, as well as critical essays on art, music, architecture, and musical scores by LaGuardia and some of them, etc. Social followed a long tradition of Cuban literary magazines that Mauricio mentioned. I don't need to repeat them. I will just mention that Gráfico, which ran between 1913 and 1918, was also associated with Massaguer, as was Carteles, which followed shortly, 1919, also associated with the Massaguer brothers. However, as Cira Romero of Cuba Literaria has observed, Social had no peers or predecessors in its role as the voice of the rising literary avant-garde. As Romero states, throughout the years, without losing its characteristics as a society chronicle, it acted as the mouthpiece of young writers who burst into the national scene with new political and cultural views that resulted in meaningful actions, such as the protest of the 13th, and later the creation of the Grupo Minorista. Many of these illustrations that you see were done by members of the Grupo Minorista. Today, it is considered ahead of all others of its time, and its transcendence is felt to this day. Juan Marinello said in 1925, "It is the most significant magazine that our nation ever had." He said this about 2 years before the founding of Revista de Avance, which was also very important. Emilio Roig de Loixengrin, the editor of the literary section of the magazine and the author of chapter 11 of Fantoches, the novel, was an active member of the Grupo Minorista, a group of young and rambunctious progressive intellectuals who had a nationalist and anti-Machado agenda, and his intention, however surreptitious at first, was to turn the magazine into the mouthpiece of the Grupo Minorista. One of the magazine's most important features was notes from the literary editor, an editorial written by Roig himself, in which he disseminated information about novel literary and artistic tendencies, and polemicized about incarcerated artists, past and present, from far and near. In the Social website of the online magazine Cuba Literaria, which you can find, if you look at Cuba Literaria, Cuba Literaria Social, then you will see all kinds of information about the magazine, as well as cover photographs, caricatures, etc., including photographs of the members of the Grupo Minorista. Cira Romero identifies 4 distinct stages in the development of the magazine, from its emergence in 1916 to its final demise in 1938. While the first period is banal in spite of its chic visual innovations, the second, comprising the period from 1923 to 28, is associated with the activities of the Grupo Minorista and is the most influential in its history. Until the creation of the Revista de Avance in 1927, directed by Francisco Ichazo, Juan Marinello, Alejo Carpentier, and Jorge Mañac, Social had been basically the only voice of the literary avant-garde in Cuba, including its political aspect. The second period had been marked by great changes. Machado had seized power in 1925. By December of that year, he was already clawing his way through the repression of labor unions and the harassment of leftist intellectuals and activists, especially Julio Antonio Meyer, who responded with a hunger strike. Born within this political context, the Grupo Minorista was composed by a group of mostly leftist young intellectuals, led by the poet, lawyer, and political activist Rubén Martínez Villena, one of the writers, who wrote one of the writers in the novel Fantoches. As apprentice and secretary to Fernando Ortiz, Villena was intimately acquainted with Ortiz's studies, which he recast as part of the cultural and political agenda of the group. His studies about Afro-Cuban history and Afro-Cuban art. Beginning in 1920, the group met at the Café Martí. Later, they relocated to the headquarters of the magazine Figaro. And finally, they organized literary and political gatherings on Saturdays at the Hotel Lafayette. By 1923, they had already orchestrated the protest of the 13th, the first milestone in the process of politicization of the intellectuals in the group, which they in which they denounce the corrupt deals behind the sale of the convent of Santa Clara. The third epoch of the magazine, 1929 to 1933, after the dissolution of the Grupo Minorista around 1927, is characterized by a series of notable foreign correspondence. Especially Carpentier wrote from Paris about the artistic, musical, and literary avant-garde. My source also said that the American journalist John Reed reported from New York, but that's impossible because the second period is 1929 to 1933, and as you probably know, John Reed died in 1920. So he must have been, unless he wrote from beyond the grave, there must have been a mistake, and he probably sent contributions in the first period of the magazine. He died, by the way, in Moscow, as most of you know. Another important correspondent was the Peruvian Marxist intellectual José Carlos Mariátegui, the author of the 7 Essays of Interpretation of Peruvian Reality, which was published in 1928, 2 years before the death of Mariátegui. And he sent some segments of his book to Social, so you can see how this why José Antonio Portuondo said that this syncretic juxtaposition of Marxism and bourgeois triviality that Social gathered in its pages went largely unnoticed by most of the bourgeois readership, who were more concerned in seeing themselves donning the fashions from Paris. They looked at the pictures, they skimmed through everything else. They skimmed through Mariátegui and Reed and everything else, but the materials were nevertheless there. After a 2-year hiatus, Social reappears in September of 1935 for its final epoch, which ends with the May-June issue of 1938, and this last epoch returns full circle to the banalities and trivialities of its beginnings, of its first period, and those are my comments about Social. I will now introduce Vicki. Vicki Gold Levi is an author, collector, and picture editor. She co-authored the book Cuba Style, Graphics from the Golden Age of Design. And she has been to Cuba 4 times and addressed the International Art Deco Conference in Havana. Her collection of vintage photography and memorabilia has been included in exhibitions at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, that famous exhibit from 2008, was it? 2007, 2008. And she recently donated her entire collection of 1,500 objects to the Wilsonian Museum. And I just want to mention that the Wilsonian Foundation also publishes the Journal of Decorative and Propaganda Arts. And the issue number 22 from 1996, 20 years ago, is a collector's item itself. It has a very important article on Social, and also it has an interview with Enrique Riveron, who was one of the most important collaborators of the magazine. And you see the cover in my edition, the drawing is by Riveron, a very important artist. Recently, as I said, she donated her collection to the University of Miami, and that will form the base for the upcoming show in May, Promising Paradise, Cuban Allure, American Seduction, which we should all visit. Okay, thank you, and I would like to welcome Vicki.
By the way, Vicki has promised to consider us in giving us some of her work. So it's not only FIU and Wilson, it's also us. We'll be glad to post it on the internet. So it will be nice to her, so she'll be nice to us. Vicki will also be bringing out something that is rarely done, which is going to be exploring the tension, if you want to use that word, or the relationship more broadly with the U.S. The fact is that many Cubans had a very close attachment And Masaguer was one of them to the U.S. You call that, some people may call that bourgeois, whatever or other, but others, so that's something very an actual expression of the modern times in that particular context, in the historical context.
Well, I
So
just
Vicki, hope you
wanted
bring
to
it up.
say, well, this show is going to be about the covers of the magazine, but the show, it's not the University of Miami, it's the Wilsonian University, which is part of Florida International University, and that show will explore the American-Cuban relationship. But I want to say I'm very excited to explore with Professor Font and Masaguer, especially his works in America, which are very hard to find, but I'm finding them. And we're going to develop a website about him and maybe Ernesto Lacona. They were two of the big crossover talents. Okay, so we're going to bring the lights.
We're salivating, eager to work on the project.
Yes, and I am too, because Miami's far to go to. I will be discussing the Art Deco graphics of Havana and their influences as interpreted by the great caricaturist, illustrator, turned editor Conrado Walter Masaguer and others. The mass-marketed magazines of Cuba catered to the cultural bourgeois and resembled leading American and European periodicals, but the Havana-based Social Carteles and Bohemia magazines possessed a true sense of Cubanness and strove to deliver an avant-garde sophistication that a new, more informed society craved, as seen here in this exquisitely executed Art Deco-style dress on the cover of Bohemia. Social was founded in 1916 by Masaguer, and he directed both Social and Carteles with a style that was affectionately coined by a reporter as tropical chic. Masaguer's magazine Social was the epitome of wit, sophistication, and a promoter of Art Deco design. The magazine was dedicated to a new cultural environment of architecture, fashion, social events, and artistic endeavors that the modernity promised. This 1926 Social magazine cover by Masaguer is an example of his wit and originality, a classical theme with a man's tie discreetly decorating a personal body part.
It's beautiful.
This cover, the cover and advertisements produced in Social and other magazines provided a vivid image of Havana as a city that was awash in modernity, as this 1926 cover by Masaguer with a striking red-haired woman representative of the modern era. The imagination and whimsy behind this 1929 Social cover by Masaguer emulates graphic cubism, futurism, and Art Deco, containing witty caricatures with an au courant illustration of a woman looking at an image of herself, looking at an image of herself. The Masaguer covers, such as this 1926 Social cover of a sophisticated, slightly exotic woman in a red turban, set the tone and the style for most of the graphic arts in Cuba during the first half of the 20th century. As Luisa Moreno, the former deputy director of the National Museum of Fine Arts in Havana and currently professor of art history at the University of Havana, said in her brilliant analysis of Social in the periodical Arte Cubano, I quote, "The most important thing about Social is the cover, because it is the combination between image and typography that makes Social stand out from the rest. The cover had a design that was characterized at times by lines emphasizing the silhouette, strong contrast, and prevalence of geometry." She goes on to say that the Art Deco designs in Social allowed the different classes to get familiarized with the avant-garde trends. This magazine opened the path for contemporary graphic design in Cuba. This carefully illustrating this 1929 Social cover are the strong architectural Art Deco lines, planes, and vibrant colors, but represents a decidedly Latin image of a woman in traditional attire. Carteles magazine, also art directed by Massaguer, plays less to the sophisticated and more to the masses, with more humor than chic, as illustrated in this 1930 cover by Massaguer, of a woman dressed in a fashionable style of the day, offering a tidbit to a monkey. As well as this 1935 Carteles cover also suggests perhaps representing a modern-day Eve with an apple. Massaguer, I've been reading about him wherever I can in dissertations and things like that, and starting in 1919 and all the way up to when he was involved with the Cuban Tourist Commission in the 50s, he really rallied against Cuba being seen as a Babylon. Now, there's no question that Americans from Prohibition came there for rum, rumba, and romance. There was plenty of houses of ill repute, but this was just a pocket of Cuba. Mostly Cuba was beautiful and elegant and wonderful sports and wonderful beaches. And Massaguer really rallied against this perception that some people had, and he did that all his life. Sometimes it even got him in some trouble. Massaguer influences were extremely ubiquitous, but came largely from North America, as you can see in this Vogue magazine, where he got some of his influences from, and also in this Vanity Fair magazine. By the way, he later did draw for Vanity Fair. And he was most influenced by Vanity Fair, as well as the New Yorker, Collier's, and Vogue magazines. The Cuban journals produced or art directed by the talented Massaguer placed Cuba on equal footing, or in my opinion, even surpassed the other magazines. You can see on the left is a Social cover, which I think is brilliant. And on the right is a variation, I don't know who influenced who in this one, but a Vanity Fair. And here's another example. On the left is this striking Social, and then a Vanity Fair, which bears some resemblance. And again, the Social on the left, on the right, excuse me, and the Vogue on the left. Maybe not yours, maybe mine. You'll figure it out. And those commissioned for his magazines were much more dramatic, sophisticated, and imaginative. And here's another example of Bohemia and Vogue that resemble each other, but again, in my opinion, the Bohemia was even more striking and imaginative and evocative. Massaguer married in 1924 and honeymooned in the U.S. at the Waldorf Hotel, and he established an office in New York City and rented an apartment across from Central Park. So he had lots of American influences and worked here. But here he is with Walt Disney later in Havana when he went back in the 50s, and he was very connected with American and European artists and illustrators. I don't know how many of you know this, but Massaguer did an American magazine about Havana called Havana. There were only 4 issues ever done. And they reside at the Library of Congress, and they're absolutely magnificent. I'm going to show you 3 of the covers. This is one. This is another, quite stunning, and another. Massaguer also worked for the American magazines such as An Early Life. It's not the Life magazine that most of you are familiar with, but there was an earlier magazine called Life that was more like Judge or Puck. It had was illustrations and humor. And this is a wonderful one. Notice the fan in her hand represents the many tourist attractions of Cuba, like highlight, golf, swimming, horse racing, and boating. No showgirls in this. Aside from the innovative Cuban magazines that he art directed and illustrated, Massaguer also turned his eye on other forms of advertising in Cuba, such as this 1939 hotel directory, this illustration for Orange Crush, which many of you might remember drinking in Cuba. I have a bottle of it in the show, and the bottle is so beautiful. It has all these little ridges, Orange Crush. And of course, when he was with the Cuban Tourist Commission, his famous, Cuba had a pavilion at the World's Fair, and this was in the 1939 Visit Cuba brochure for the World's Fair. And in his most iconic image of Visit Cuba, which proclaims so near and yet so foreign. And of course, one can't help but think about, when I started my research in the late 90s and my collection, I had no idea that Obama would land in Cuba and there would be Starwood hotels and whatever's going to happen. That you could never have collected what I collected, like, since this happened. I've been collecting this since 1999, and it was certainly a huge surprise to me. Everybody writes me, what perfect timing. I assure you, I had nothing to do with it. Most of the images presented here today were from my personal collection, and wait a minute, I missed something. Okay. Well, anyhow, this was a magazine that was not Massaguer's, but just to show you how beautiful the magazine covers were. These perfiles or profiles. This was another portion of Art Deco that, in a cartoonish way, promoted Bacardi and Hathaway, and very, very Art Deco. And El Encante, which I'm sure many of you remember shopping at. They did beautiful illustrations that often had an Art Deco flavor to them. And this is a sole sheet of Ernesto Lecuona, which has definite Art Deco lines and graphics. He had a lot of crossover music, but of course he was most famous in Cuba. And I'm interested in the people like Ernesto Lecuona, Massaguer, and even Desi Arnaz, who what really set up most Americans to love Cuba was Mr. Babalu. Of course, he wasn't the real Mr. Babalu, that was Miguelito Galvez. But still, he gets the credit for popularizing it. And Siboney, yes, who sings Siboney? This was another crossover tune, and it was so beautifully illustrated in this graphic presentation. This was Leo Feist, a New York publisher. They crossed over Malagueña, Siboney, and others. This is the cover of my book. And if any of you want to take a look at the book, it's here. You can look at it. You know, it was first done in 2002 by Princeton Architectural Press, but it's just been reprinted, I'm happy to say. And this is the Wilsonian Museum, which Anne Marie mentioned. I just gave them 1,500 objects, photographs, memorabilia, three-dimensional objects. And this Art Deco image was even used as an inspiration for a delightfully illustrated Cuban restaurant right here in New York. If you ever go to Havana Central, I decorated all the walls, and all the posters in there come from me. So I want to thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to present to this conference, and I want to thank the director, Mauricio Font, and his moderator, Professor Ana Maria Hernández. And I hope I come back and talk to you about other things at other times. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For me, it's a discovery. For many of you, probably it's a rediscovery. I think in any case, we have a wonderful figure that we have to go back and take advantage of the 100 years of Social to acknowledge, to recognize, and perhaps bring out to light in this moment, as Vicki pointed out, in which Cuba is going back to tourism as a main industry. When that tourist art, I hate to say this to my friends, everybody's is better than a lot of what is being produced today, right?
Oh my goodness. I think Massaguer, and also some of the artists like Carrera, his family is doing a book on his art, Riveron, you mentioned, and Acosta. I mean, they also were painters. And I think that I've seen, in my collection, I have over 150 magazines. And and each one is better than the next. When it gets into the 50s, it gets a little kitschy for me, you know. There's a lot of American themes on it. It's amazing to see a Cuban magazine with a Statue of Liberty on it or American flag, but there's plenty of them. But it gets a little cartoony for me. I like the earlier versions better, which were so sophisticated and so witty, and there's nobody like Massagüera.
Thank you, Mauricio, for always inviting me to participate in these wonderful discussions. And thank you, Ana Maria. I do want to acknowledge, because it's rare that a scholar can acknowledge the presence of the university in the audience, and so Dr. Kathy Walden is here, and I'm very honored that she has come all the way from New Jersey. She's a Latin Americanist and very active also supporting the Builder Center. In a letter of April 21st, 1987, the late Enrique Labrador Ruiz, one of Cuba's most eminent writers, short stories, writers, as well as journalists, responded to the question of what were the politics of Cuban artists during the island's democratic years with the following. I quote, "We were coming out of a period of great frustration and defeats. I am referring to the failed or betrayed revolution of 1933 and the destruction of the Spanish Republic in 1939 by Franco and his fascists, the assassination of Trotsky in August 1940. War was imminent in Europe, and we were embarking on a democratic experience. The artists and writers were torn between the street and the ivory tower. By March 10th, 1952, the street was covered with refuse and corruption, and the ivory tower stunk of escapism. What was one to do?" End of quote. And of course, here you see Labrador in all his glory in 1942, Trotsky assassinated, Guiteras and Batistas from 1933, Guernica in 1937, and of course, Franco welcoming his troops in a Madrid under fascist domination. Between 1940 and 1952, the Republic of Cuba experienced its only fully democratic and constitutional period. Although it is true that corruption and gangsterismo were rampant, particularly, some historians have argued, between 1948 and 1952, when it comes to individual rights, social justice, and economic expansion, there should be no doubt that these were the island's most democratic years. This is the period of the very progressive Constitution of 1940, Fulgencio Batista's only constitutional governance, the auténtico years of President Grau's La Cubanidad es Amor, and President Prio as el Presidente Cordial, as well as Eduardo Chivas' Vergüenza contra Dinero slogan against the corruption of the auténticos. Let us also recall that the foreign policy of the auténtico governments of these years was staunchly and actively opposed to the dictatorships in Venezuela, the dictatorships in Nicaragua, as well as the Dominican Republic. And they, of course, also favored independence for the neo-colonial island of Puerto Rico. This is the political and historical framework in which a cultural renaissance of visual art developed. And there, of course, you have Los Hombres Fuertes, or maybe Not So Fuertes. The earlier generation of avant-garde artists, those that began to exhibit in the late 20s and early 1930s, and to me, the best examples of these remain painters like Carlos Enríquez, Amelia Peláez, and Fidelio Ponce, had sympathized with the ideals of the Grupo Minorista, with a few of them even signing the manifesto, Abela, Gatorno, and Sicre, which called for a renewal of the cultural and political life of the nation. In the 1940s, with many of their comrades from the failed Revolution of '33 having achieved political power, either in the first Batista government or in the two auténtico governments of both Grau and Prio, these painters found some measure of official support through modest commissions, prizes at the yearly National Salon, and purchases from the state. Yet, artists like Enríquez and Ponce, with their anarchic temperaments, saw themselves as independent critics who did not fit in bourgeois Cuban society of the 1940s. They were cynical about Cuban politics, while Amelia Peláez quietly favored the auténtico governments that helped women achieve the right to vote. Of course, here are examples of their work. Ponce in a letter from 1946 would state, and I quote, "This is a miserable republic, and yet no doubt an improvement over Batista's shitty government. We have democracy, but it is corrupt. Labor unions assure a decent life for workers, but no one in this island gives a shit about artists." And I have to tell you that my translation cannot really get it correctly because what he says, "A nadie le importa un carajo." And those of you who know Spanish know that it's impossible to really translate that. Wilfredo Lam had returned to Cuba from France due to World War II. His social political baggage included many years in Spain and France, the Spanish Civil War, and a serious engagement with Surrealism and Trotskyism. In the Cuba of the 1940s, he stood aloof from his contemporaries in the island that had limited experience of Europe. His inner circle consisted of novelist Alejo Carpentier, who, by the way, also had Surrealist and Trotskyist connections, the Trotskyist poets and activists Mary Lowe and Juan Emilio Brea, and politicians and activists such as Charles Simeón and Manuel Machado, the last who would eventually be part of the Prior government, as well as very elite elements of Cuban society who supported his work, like Fernando Theis and Lidia Cabrera. Undoubtedly an opportunist when it came to politics, Lam received a modest monthly subvention from the Batista government, thanks to Cabrera, while maintaining alliances with the Cuban Trotskyists. Other key groups of artists around this time revolved around patrons, art critics, and writers. Heiress María Luisa Gómez Mena, who was married to painter Mario Carreño from 1942 to 45, cultivated a circle of painters like her husband, Cundo Bermúdez, Felipe Orlando Martínez Pedro, and the critic José Gómez Sicre. Politically, they were liberals, fellow travelers, some even former communists, such as Bermúdez and Carreño, and all staunchly anti-Batista. This group felt that Batista had stolen the election of 1940 from Grau, and that he was a culturally uncouth primitive. For an aesthetic compass, they looked not to Paris, but to New York, and specifically to the Museum of Modern Art under the leadership of Alfred Barr. And keep in mind that MoMA had only been founded in 1929, so it was a relatively young institution at that time. While Fernando Ortiz and Lidia Cabrera were more politically fluid in their alliances, aesthetically they favored a high cultural appropriation of the popular culture. And of course, the one Cuban artist they took under their wing was Wilfredo Lam. He was a Francophile like Cabrera. And by the way, Lam's former wife, Helena Holzer Benitez, assured me that Cabrera would speak to Lam in French at social occasions. But then people have also said to me that Lam didn't speak that good French either. So. Cabrera, in particular, disliked the young critic José Gómez Sicre. In her view, he was, after all, self-taught and had never traveled to Europe. And then, of course, there was the Orígenes group, centered around the poet José Lezama Lima. They cultivated what some sarcastically defined, and I'm quoting, as esoteric intellectual masturbation about poetic metaphors in a third world tropical island, end of quote. Their aesthetic compass was French and Spanish. Mallarmé and Valéry, Góngora and Juan Ramón Jiménez. They saw themselves above the fray of corrupt national politics and embraced a Baroque Blanco Criollo Catholicism. The trio of visual artists that were part of this group, and there's María Luisa Gómez Mena. The trio of visual artists that were part of this group were a kind of contradiction in terms. Painter Mariano Rodriguez, best known for his colorful and expressionistic depiction of roosters, was a communist who held the masses in contempt. Sculptor Alfredo Lozano, who shifted from blocky figuration to organic abstraction, held the same position. While the draftsman of the group, René Portocarrero, was a former communist and a homosexual who was a believing Catholic, and ultimately the creator of a joyous and tropical Baroque style. The art critic within them was Guy Pérez Cisneros, a Francophile to the bone. For him, Mexican art was too political and vulgar, abstraction was anti-humanist, and he preferred not to look at what he saw as, and I quote, the cold and impersonal US Protestant machine in favor of the School of Paris. His inspiration, intellectually speaking, were the neo-Thomist philosophers Jacques Maritain and Etienne Gilson, as well as the art criticism of Élie Faré. Unlike the rest of the Orígenes group, and this is significant, Pero Cisneros was directly involved in the political and social spheres of the nation. He was a diplomat by education. He joined the Foreign Service under Batista's constitutional government and served both under Grau and Prios administration. He is acknowledged to have contributed greatly to the writing of the UN Charter of Human Rights at the end of World War II. What all of these groups had in common is that they were affected by the laws of the Spanish Republic in 1939. They were all generally anti-Franco and had been active in committees of solidarity with the Spanish Republic. Even Orígenes, in spite of his Catholicism, was anti-Franco, due no doubt to the influence of anti-fascist writers like Jiménez, Guillén, Cernuda, and María Zambrano. Its priest-poet member, Monsignor Ángel Gastelu, was Basque and therefore anti-Franco. Older intellectuals from the previous generation, those who had opposed the Machado regime, such as Fernando Ortiz, Juan Marinello, and Jorge Mañasch, that you see here in these marvelous portraits by Arce, were significant at this period also. Ortiz, who began as a positivist, with some would argue a patronizing view of Afro-Cubans, became an advocate of Afro-Cuban culture and a left-wing liberal, critical of the socio-economic heritage of colonial Spain. He embraced the constitutional Batista government, collaborated with the Auténticos, and kept his distance from the government after the March 1952 coup. Marinello, who began as a highly original Marxist thinker, deteriorated into a Stalinist who preferred a figuration with nationalist narrative. Since Batista legalized the communists as part of his election strategy in 1940, Marinello and his comrades supported Batista and even became ministers without portfolio in his government. Mañasch evolved from a conservative nationalist, active in the ABC, to a progressive and ethical one, who wanted to see as reality the ideas of José Martí in Cuban governance. Briefly, he was foreign minister of Batista's government in 1944. He critiqued the corruption and gangsterismo under the Auténticos, which led him to be a founder of the Ortodoxo Party. Ortiz preferred Lam as a painter, but was open-minded enough to support many of the artists Gomesica promoted, much to the chagrin of his sister-in-law, Lidia Cabrera. Marinello favored his contemporaries, particularly those whose work had much in common with Mexican art, Abela, Gatorno, Arce. Mañasch was perhaps the least dogmatic of all. After all, he had studied painting at the San Alejandro Academy, so he appreciated all of the Cuban moderns, from Fidelio Ponce all the way up to René Portocarrero. A number of cultural historians argue that the second half of the 1940s was el momento de Orígenes, the moment of Orígenes. And there is no doubt that the writers, the poets in particular, were a unique group of creators whose texts both reflect a profound manifestation of Cuban identities, while at the same time transcending Cuba and Latin America. Just to mention four of the writers, Elisa Molina, Eliseo Diego, Gastón Vaquero, and Virgilio Piñera, who, by the way, was the odd man out as an absurdist, atheist gay man who did not click with the Catholic and Baroque aesthetics of the group. They revitalized the Spanish language and proposed visions of the world that are highly original and idiosyncratic. They were, in the words of Octavio Paz, universal Cubans, like José Martí. The three visual artists of the group added rich vocabularies to Cuban art. Portocarrero's paintings and drawings have, I believe, stood the test of time. His expressionism is the antithesis of most expressionist art. His is joyous, exalting through color, texture, and a beautifully agitated line, an experience of the world as transcendental enjoyment. Politically, the Orígenes group shifted from an apolitical elitism from about 1945 to 52 to an opportunistic position that gladly received some patronage for the publication of their magazine after Batista's 1952 coup. As Lezama famously stated, Cuba was an inherently politically frustrated country. There was nothing to be done about it except write poetry and print pictures from the ivory tower. Throughout the 1940s, Cuba was one of those places that everybody wanted to visit, together with Mexico and Brazil. Among the influential visitors that decade were Alfred H. Barr Jr., director of the Museum of Modern Art, Pablo Neruda, undoubtedly the most influential of Latin American poets, and David Alfaro Siqueiros, the apostle of Mexican mural painting, as he was called. fresh from fleeing Mexico after the Trotsky assassination. It's important to remember that. Bar would organize the 1904 exhibition, Modern Cuban Painters. Neruda would establish deep bonds of friendship with many Cuban writers and artists. And Siqueiros would influence some of Mario Carreño's best work. Bar was one of the key figures to help internationalize Cuban art, with funds from María Luisa Gómez Mena, and he mentored José Gómez Sicre, who had the visual arts section at the Pan American Union between 1946 and 1983, introduced the contemporary art of Latin America to US audiences. There were many, many visitors. These visitors, and many more, such as Stravinsky, Breton, Stuart Davis, George McNeil, James Porter, Aaron Copland, Wallace Stevens, and many others, not only reflected the Popular Front politics of opposing fascism and supporting the Allies, but also the curiosity of looking for an exotic other. But here was the surprise, that when they arrived at the island, they encountered a highly sophisticated culture that surprised them. In the 1940s, there was a pictorial boom in Cuba. A major exhibition of Cuban art in 1940, 300 años de arte en Cuba, organized at the University of Havana by both Guy Pérez Cisneros and the painter Domingo Ravenet. The opening of the short-lived gallery Galería del Prado by María Luisa Gómez Mena, which Larador Ruiz sarcastically called La Vida Breve because of his short lifespan. And of course, there was also the activist agenda of Raúl Roa, who was the director of Dirección de Cultura in the Prior government, supported exhibitions of Cuban art in Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Stockholm, and Paris. The country was booming financially during the immediate post-World War II period. A new and more dynamic social mobility was becoming apparent, but corruption persisted, as well as the violent culture of gangsterismo. The younger generations of artists were ready to rebel. And forgive me if I get a little emotional, because the figure on the left of your screen was a very dear friend who just passed away earlier this year, the sculptor and political activist Roberto Guerrero. The younger generation of artists were ready to rebel. Between 1949 and 51, a new cultural group, Sociedad Cultural Nuestro Tiempo, appeared on the scene. And I quote from their manifesto: "We are the voice of a new generation that is coming forward at a time in which some would see violence, desperation, and death as the only solutions. We define ourselves by the man who is never in crisis, for his work is an enduring essence. Our aesthetic is that of an American art, free of political and religious prejudices, beyond concessions, synthesis of that which we consider relevant and permanent in America. We have arisen to bring art to the people, bring it near the aesthetic and cultural concerns of our time. Precisely now, we're already sensing these realities. We demand a vehicle that will allow the people to touch and assimilate these for its fast formation and cultural maturity. We are ready to fight." End of quote. Their manifesto, published in 1951, was signed by its 20-odd founders, including journalist and activist Carlos Franchi, writer and film critic Guillermo Cabrera Infante, composer Harold Gramaches, sculptor Roberto Estopiñán, poet Roberto Fernández Retamar, etc. These artists and intellectuals rejected the corruption of the Antélticos, as well as the Blanco Criollo Baroque figuration of artists like Bermúdez, Carreño, Mariano, and Portocarrero. A fusion of Marxism and existentialism, Nuestro Tiempo was the antithesis to Orígenes' Hermetic aesthetics. It emerged as the leading left-leaning cultural institution, eventually publishing a journal from 1954 to 59, and running a gallery from 1955 to 59, that resisted the cultural program of the Batistato after the March 1952 coup. The artists proposed what they called a Cuban universalism, such as Estopiñán developing a formalist humanism inspired by Henry Moore and Marino Marini, Diago and Cabrera Infante recycling Picasso into their own language. In time, the non-communists of the group, Franchi, Cabrera Infante, Estopiñán, the future cinematographer Néstor Almendros, would depart, transforming the society into a front for the Partido Socialista Popular. That's actually the name of the Cuban Communist Party before 1959. more rebels emerged in the 1950s. But before that, let's talk about the non-rebels for a moment. After the 1952 coup, the majority of Cuban artists openly resisted Batista's disruption of constitutional life. But there were a few who had no problem embracing what Batista was proposing. And here is what I would call a somewhat gallery of dishonor. Of course, there's the coup, there's an image of the assassinated José Antonio Echevarría, and then figures that, interestingly, both achieved acclaim both in Castro's Cuba and in the exile. Domingo Ravenet, lifelong member of the Cuban Communist Party, who died in Cuba receiving a lot of honors from the revolution. Gaston Vaquero, a great poet, but sadly a man with no political compass, who died in Madrid. Next to him, one of the great sacred cows of Cuban ethnology, Lidia Cabrera. Below her, Eduardo Abela, wonderful painter who was part of the Minorista group, but who quickly accepted a position serving in the Foreign Service, first under Batista in 1940, and he continued after the coup in 52. And then, of course, Mario Carreño, who had been such an independent figure, basically ends up working for the Dirección de Cultura under Guillermo de Sendegui, under the Batista regime. And what's interesting about Carreño, and I'll give you this little anecdote, is that, of course, eventually he will marry a Chilean, and he will go to Chile. And there he will become an integral part of the development of modern painting in Chile. But during the Allende administration, when Fidel Castro visited Cuba, Carreño, who was a close friend of Neruda, was invited to a reception in the National Palace. Neruda assured him that he should not get in line to say hello to Fidel. Carreño said, "Of course I am. I am a Cuban and I am a Chilean." And of course, when he came up the line, Fidel turned his back on him and said, "I do not shake the hands of Batistianos." So grudges are held for a long time. Here are two really wonderful idiosyncratic figures of this time period. Poets Jorge Valls and Israel Rodriguez, both left-wing and independent Catholics. They rejected the Hermeticism of Orígenes and the Marxism of Nuestro Tiempo, although they both had friends in Nuestro Tiempo. They would be militants in the Directorio and favor a wide aesthetic agenda, and specifically abstract art. And clearly you can recognize that this is Valls, but I do want to point out, and I know that the person who was involved in curating the photography component of that great show in Canada is here. I want to point out to her that when me and my friends went to see the exhibition, we had a real emotional moment because we discovered the figure of Israel Rodriguez, a young man, there protesting. And this, of course, was someone who was very much a part of the political activism of the exile, particularly in the Northeast. And he passed away in 2008. And there he is, just like he was as an old professor of literature in a New Jersey university, full of energy and ready to punch somebody out. He and Valls offer a very interesting counterpoint to both the escapist Catholicism of Orígenes and the more structured left-wing position of people of Nuestro Tiempo. In his unjustly forgotten 1953 book of poems, Patria Nueva, with a prologue by Jorge Mañash, by the way, Rodriguez would write, and I beg you, I will not translate into English because I'm not a good translator of poetry, so I will read it in Spanish. But I think most of you will get the gist of what he was saying in terms of a call, both political and aesthetic, at this time. La patria necesita hombres, hechos de sangre y de sueños, con honda raíz en la tierra y llenos de alas, como los árboles con frutos. Y no tener temor de ser raíz, porque se es firme, ni de ser tronco, porque se es valiente, ni de estar lleno de alas, porque se está lleno de frutas. La patria necesita hombres que amen la acción que nace del pensamiento, que amen lo divino sin despreciar lo humano. End of quote. After 1959, Valls would end up in Castro's prison and Rodriguez in exile. More rebels continued to emerge in the 50s. The abstract expressionists known as Los Onces, the geometric artists known as Diez Pintores Concretos. Like the Nuestro Tiempo artists, these rejected the earlier Cuban figurative and more picturesque art, favoring instead a rough abstraction that revolted against societal chaos, or a form of geometric art that imposed a purist, even utopic order on a corrupt and even debauched society. They tended to favor the ortodoxos before the 1952 coup. After it, many of them, like Estopiñán, joined the ranks of the revolution against Batista through either the Directorio Revolucionario or the 26th of July movement. I leave you with images of and by both Roberto Estopiñán and Rafael Soriano, members of the third vanguardia that arose in the 1950s. And both of them just passed away this past year. They both optimistically embraced the revolution of 1959. Both were in exile by the early 1960s. Soriano wanted to do his work in peace, if not in an ivory tower, at least in the art school that he founded in his native Matanzas in the late 1940s. Estopiñán, of a more revolutionary temperament, wanted to transform Cuban society into a true democracy with social and economic justice. He told me over and over, he always preferred the street to the ivory tower. But then came exile, and with it, a profound transformation, because they went from being good artists to great artists. In exile, Labrador Ruiz, who had evolved politically since the 1940s from fellow traveler to card-carrying communist to an anti-communist after the 1957 invasion of Hungary, would write, "We had it all wrong, thinking it was a choice between the street and the ivory tower. The artists need to be true to their work and to their time. Best to not be in the street corner or in the tower, be it of ivory or ebony. We should have sat on the front porch of our modest home, La Patria, with both the door and windows wide open." Thank you.